Welcome to Philosophy of Value Workshops number 6 of series 11. The question for the day is Kantian ethics irredeemably flawed, or can its central principles be salvaged? Reading from one of my works, The Pursuit of Value, chapter 4, section 6. Ethics can be said to have practical concerns about what to do. And I'm also asking, what can we do with our lives? But classical ethics has different concerns than modern ethics. Kantian and modern ethics, for example, ask the question, how should we act? Or what actions are ethical? Classical or Aristotelian ethics asks, what is a good or flourishing life of happiness? My concerns align much more with these classical questions, and that is part of my critique of Kantian ethics. Yet my approach differs from the classical in a number of ways that weren't available in classical times. That is, I'm presenting problems of life in terms of consciousness and finding answers in terms of value. And I answer in terms of an affirmation or a will to value leading to a certain sufficiency of value. This current series of workshops on ethics can explain what that means. One consequence of this view is that value is the more general and explanative category of which ethics is a part. So in this way, ethical principles are values which guide moral action. In religion, God is the believer's highest value, which gives meaning to his life. And a meaningful life is also a worthwhile and valuable life. Yet this means that the values of ethics, religion, meaning and aesthetics must compete against each other, as well as that Kantian ethics must compete with Aristotelian, utilitarian and other theories of ethics. And this is why we must examine the strengths, weaknesses and the adequacy of Kantian ethics. In this study, we'll first look at the background of his ethics before examining the arguments. Yet both Kant's philosophy and his ethics are notoriously complex and difficult to define. One shortcut sees Kant's ethics as a reformulation of Christian ethics of goodwill and the value of other people. Yet he wants to do this on the basis of reason without reference to a belief in God. He is, however, criticised as making tacit appeals to religious ideas to justify his views, such as resolving the unacceptable consequences of his injunctions in an afterlife. So with respect to religion, Kantian ethics has thereby been thought to share the criticisms of Christianity. For example, a key idea in Kant's categorical imperative that we will discuss shortly is its humanity. But his idea of humanity has aspects of self-abnegation said to be found in religion. One idea is that we owe God everything, which demeans and detracts from humanity. This is illustrated by Iris Murdoch, a Christian and Kantian who writes in such a spirit of human abnegation. She writes that a genuine sense of mortality enables us to see virtue as the only thing of worth, and the acceptance of our own nothingness is a spur to our concern with what is not ourselves. More specifically, Susan Wolff presents us with the idea of a Kantian moral saint who is lacking in humanity. Wolff cites Maria von Herbert's case of rigid adherence to honesty that doesn't lead to personal well-being. Wolff presents here the kind of person whose every action as morally good as possible. But that isn't a model of well-being that would be good or desirable to strive for. Yet like everyone else, as well as all great thinkers, Kant was surprisingly limited by the ideas of his era. For example, It's often said that one could hardly find anyone who didn't believe in God in pre-Renaissance times. And in Kant's era, truth, fact and universality as aspects of reason were also reified due to their rarity. This was an age in conflict with superstition, witchcraft and rampant erroneous understanding of the world. Conversely, Renaissance reason, science and human potential were greatly regarded. Reason was thereby thought of as an unmitigated good, without much critical redress. Kant wrote two huge books to address this problem: Critique of Pure Reason and Critique of Practical Reason. These were great but seminal works without the weight of modern perspectives on reason and logic. So Kant attempted to establish ethics on, as we will see, a limited conception of reason. But even more problematic is Kant's rationalistic conception of morality as universalization, and that his primacy of universalization fails to grasp the basic nature of morality. That is, in my view, morality as a phenomenal value experience of so-called good and evil. So given these and other failings, we might well ask the question, why bother to examine Kantian ethics? It's because his perspective of both ethics and philosophy were enormously encompassing and innovative. It's often said that a student can't circumvent Kant. You have to go through him and understand him. You need to understand what the problems are and even understand the mistakes that Kant made. It can even be said that Kant was a genius, even though he was a flawed genius. He was attempting to reconcile and integrate aspects of moral life that previously hadn't been synthesized. He wrestled with the problem of how subjective moral states could also be objective. And he tried to do this using the dual status of reason, which is both objective as an aspect of logic and subjective as an integral part of the mind. Miranda Fricker of Birkbeck University explains that morality based on reason within us is brought under our control of the individual agent. In Kant, we see a reconciliation of the universal and the individual, but also an internalization, so the moral status of our actions is under our control. In a way, for the ancients, it wasn't. Unquote. So one key and pivotal idea in Kant's ethics is the idea of reason, which is applied in different ways. And we thereby find in Kant, as well as for ourselves, at least three aspects or kinds of reason. One, the usual meaning of reason as thinking about means to an end. Two, a reason as denoting the significance of fact or a certain conception of things. And three, reason as an expression of universality, as in mathematics, logic, or non-contradiction. And reason expressed as universality is formulated in Kant's categorical imperative as a universal law, that always act, so that you may also wish that your maxim of your action become a universal law. Unquote. Yet we'll need to later return to this universalization of a maxim in order to explain it. And we'll see that Kant's applications of reason are subject to certain criticisms, such as, firstly, as above, Kant tacitly appeals to religious values and cultural prejudices that are unjustified by reason. He assumes a moral order implicit in religion, as noted above, and needs an afterlife to rectify bad consequences. So Kant presupposed a universal moral order. This is an understandable assumption. It seems that something about morals must be universal in order for it to be moral at all. Or we have to contend with the ethical inversion posed by Sartre's character Jean Genet: good be my evil, evil be my good. A vital question here is whether and how universality refers to the material content of particular actions, or whether it is referring to the formal content of an underlying principle. We can dismiss universally fixed morals of particular actions like the Ten Commandments. But Kant's universality also refers to the material content of action in the formulation of a universal maxim. That is, even though that material content is constructed and chosen on the basis of its universalization. But as noted, universalization as a moral criterion can be seriously questioned, and in my view, morality should also take account of the agent's awareness, intentions, and belief. So the material content of moral action will be contingent on beliefs and awareness. This means that any theory of material moral action needs to be fallibilist. But Kant's view is that moral action must be correct and determinable. I present value theory ethics as a fallibilist theory in future study. Kant might evade this problem by prioritizing intention and goodwill as the only thing that's good in itself. And he actually seems to give priority to goodwill and intention over universality when he writes, "Nothing can be conceived in the world which can be called good except a goodwill." We will discuss Kant's particular qualifications of intention shortly. But Kant's goodwill isn't the expected one of attitude, subjective quality of intent, or moral disposition. His conception of goodwill depends upon the compliance of the will to conform to the content of a maxim that has been chosen because of its universality. Kant's goodwill consists of a congruence between the conception of an intent and a maxim. So Kant doesn't provide either the subjective account that we might want or an escape from criticisms of cognitive foundations or of universality. Secondly, there is a problem in using reason to establish moral values exemplified in Hume's law or principle. Hume argued that a prescriptive ought can't be derived from a factual is, nor morals from reason. The problem is expressed another way in how can values be supervenient upon objects or ideas? Or again, how can objects, ideas or principles necessarily engage the moral will? We will see that Kant's appeal to goodwill, duty and dignity doesn't resolve this problem. A third problem about reason is the supposed motivational power or impotence of cognition. Cognitivists explain morals and motivation, but primarily in terms of reason and a certain conception of things. John McDowell, for example, tried to explain motivating cognitive capacities as favourable light or perceptual capacity. But favourable light and perceptual capacity seem to need explanations with non-cognitive values. But Kant's account implies that a certain conception of things is by itself sufficient to motivate moral action. That is, he holds that we ought to follow the moral law just because we understand that the law is right. And because we understand that the moral law is right, it is our duty to practice it. Yet these two ideas of doing what is right and a duty to do it require explanation. I have myself argued that the idea of truth makes inescapable claims on our moral will. Yet it's strongly argued that truth is indefinable, and Kant's moral law also need not represent truth. And duty is a moral obligation to act in a way presupposed by a particular meaning of duty, which for Kant is given in the ideas of universalization and the cultural mores of the day. That is, duty was revered in Teutonic and Victorian culture. But not only is Kant's application of reason in doubt, but also his conception of reason. The concept of reason has been expanded since Kant to include both the unconscious and modal logic. He also believed that Euclidean geometry was inherently true, like his synthetic a priori truth. But non-Euclidean geometries challenged both Euclidean axioms and Kant's philosophy. Nietzsche had his own critiques of reason and the supposed inviolable value of truth. And today, Simon Blackburn can speak of the tyranny of rationalism. But Kant wanted to establish universal laws based on reason, like those of science. And his categorical imperative also only applied to rational creatures and thereby had that limitation. These and other ambiguities produced deep tensions in Kant between the elements he is seeking to synthesize. The tensions are between an affirmation of humanity and its seeming abnegation in rules and reason. They are also between reason and Kant's religious presuppositions and cultural intuitions. A difficult reconciliation is further sought between the universal and the individual, and thereby also between the objective and the subjective that hasn't been resolved. But to get to the heart of Kant's moral philosophy, we have to examine his categorical imperative. Kant's categorical imperative has three main aspects: universality, humanity, and autonomy. Firstly, the universality of reason is to always act so that your action become a universal law, unquote. 2. The aspect of humanity is to always treat humanity as an end and never merely as a means. And 3. Autonomy is expressed in free choice, that we must choose to give the moral law to ourselves. To explain further, Kant distinguished his categorical imperative from hypothetical imperatives. Hypothetical imperatives only hold on certain circumstances, that is, if they obtain. Categorical imperatives are principles that always must be followed and are a priori and self-validating, like 2 + 2 = 4, Aristotle's principles of logic, and the cogito ergo sum. The role of reason in Kant's categorical imperative is thereby crucial but disputed classically by Hume, and it has been questioned more recently by Ian McFetrich, Philippa Foot, and John McDowell. Foot, for example, doubts Kant's categorical imperative, and that it is instead a hypothetical imperative. That is, Kant's moral imperative is only an imperative on some prior premise, like a feeling. Yet the three aspects of Kant's moral philosophy are known as his universality, his humanity, and his autonomy. We can now discuss these three aspects of his categorical imperative, starting with universality. The concept of universality is at the center of both Kant's ethics and how he defines the character of morality. But universality is challenged both by exceptions and as inadequate in explaining what morality is. Yet this challenge calls for an alternative, such as morality as character, as in virtue theory. I have myself defined morality as reflecting value back onto the agent as the moral experience. But we don't have time to explain these alternatives at the moment. Yet we saw that Kant's conception of the good will depends upon compliance to conform to a universal maxim. But this doesn't provide the kind of subjective moral intent or value experience that it seems to need. In explanation, it is sometimes said that Kant appears to regard feeling as pathological, and his typology of mind as cognition, feeling and will also conspicuously omits value. Yet, as noted, Kant's universality is expressed as a need to construct and affirm a universal maxim. So we must ask whether it's possible in practice to construct such a universal maxim. That is, circumstances can be so variable that no maxim or principle of action could be adequate. For example, a maxim might be help people in trouble, but the person in trouble might be the mad axeman. Then some qualification could be made to modify the maxim, but the qualifications needed are unending, turning a principle into a form of pragmatism. This objection might seem to be just trivial and go against the letter rather than the spirit of the categorical imperative. But the universality of the categorical imperative is supposed to replace judgments with reason, and the neo-Kantian W.D. Ross takes up this problem with prima facie duties, as we discuss later. Kant's injunction also raises the question of the kind of principle or maxim that a rational will might impose. No doubt that Kant has a universal standard of reason in mind, but that can nevertheless be questioned. And what counts as a valid reason for action is also subject to interpretation. That is, a universal standard still leaves open the question of what exactly is that standard. I previously noted, for example, differences between cognitively based, desire-based and value-based theories of action. And the concept of the relative strength of reason also stands against any unequivocal theories. Yet for Kant, for a maxim to be a universal law, it cannot be contradictory, incoherent, or even equivocal. Examples of such incoherence or contradictoriness are Kant's absolute prohibitions on lying and suicide. But these examples reiterate the question of how Kant's universalization is to be applied. He insists that there can be only one categorical imperative at our highest level of practical reasoning. This view implies the kind of account criticized by Alan Wood of moral theory as the attempt to formulate precise principles from which we can rigorously derive a set of conclusions about what to do in all or actual imaginary cases, unquote. It could be a matter of judgment as to whether such an account, without exception or moderation, is plausible. But to assist that judgment, I will draw attention to problems of universality for any practical system. I will then want to make a more explicit criticism of Kant's determination of right and wrong. That is, firstly, for example, in engineering, it's impossible to design anything from a purely theoretical basis. Designs of engines, cars or rockets are made through a process of continual development and rectification. Similar rectifications must be expected in the much more complex human world of ethics. But Kant contentiously believes that his premise is absolutely correct and all-encompassing. These considerations lead me to the view that rather than formulating universal maxim, we should be making individual judgments depending on circumstances and principles other than reason. As the engineering example indicates, complete universalization, objectivity, or standardization seems to be a rationalist dream. whether based on either reason or on structures of consciousness. And a complete universalization of moral action may also be neither possible or desirable. Another example is that Kant advocated complete objectivity and impartiality when dealing with people. This sounds good, but incurs the problem of moral distancing in treating family and strangers alike. For example, in choosing between the death of my father and a stranger, humanity calls me to choose a stranger. But Kant would want me to weigh their moral value as equals, which indicates a lack of humanity. An earlier example was that Kant also advocated that we must never lie, not the sometimes, but always. He endorsed this view in an essay entitled On a Supposed Right to Tell Lies from Benevolent Motives. He argues that even white lies are never acceptable, even to a mad axeman at the door. There could be no exceptions, because in Kant's view, the moral law is the law. It can't be violated. Kant sees reason exclusively, and he emphasized his claimed clarity and certainty with a scientific metaphor. I quote, "Two things fill the mind with ever new and increasing admiration and awe, the starry heavens above and the moral law within me." This view of clarity and certainty has been described as an apodictic method of seeking unquestionable truth. This method begins with absolute principles or premises that can't be challenged or changed. But this apodictic thinking led Kant into untenable presuppositions about reason, universality, and morality. And apodictic thinking then prevents contingent judgments being made for particular cases. It also prevents alternative conceptions of ethics and morality, which can't be ruled out. Yet Kant's conception of humanity formed the second aspect of his categorical imperative. Together with his respect for autonomy as free will, Kant's humanity seems to be a valid criterion. This validity is reinforced by his practical view of enlightenment as the intellectual independence, maturity and courage to use the knowledge of who we are, unquote. More explicitly, the notion of humanity in Kant's ethics is expressed as treating people as ends in themselves. And treating people as ends in themselves is also to recognize people as having intrinsic value. Yet for Kant, an explanation of another person's intrinsic value depends on his rationality. As noted, the origin of that intrinsic value to people is often thought to derive from the Christian incarnation. Yet for Kant, the intrinsic value of another is also a universalization of one's own intrinsic value. And I've argued that value isn't subject to transferability in this way or any other way. But even more critically, Kant's recognition of the intrinsic value of other people as ends in themselves is only that. It is a recognition or a claim that appears to be presupposed by Kant with minimal argument. And even if accepted, it still needs to be argued why we need to value the intrinsic value of others. A sadist, for example, could accept the intrinsic value of others to enhance his sadistic satisfactions. But these criticisms are mild compared with Kant's association with Christian endorsement of slavery and homophobia. Hans-Georg Moller of Macao University also points out Kant's prejudices in his The Metaphysics of Morals. Here, Kant strongly advocates the death penalty and holds homosexuality to be intolerable. These prejudices might simply be excused, even for a philosopher, as reflecting social norms. but he seems to contradict all three of these principles in holding that servants can be controlled by force. That is, they don't have freedom of employment, and if they run away, they shall be brought back by force. Worse still, killing illegitimate children shouldn't be considered as murder, as it's like disposing of contraband. This advice appears to contradict Kant's principle of humanity, to treat people as ends rather than means. His other views, like never lying and absolute impartiality between family and strangers, also seems inhumane. They indicate a fanaticism that puts the consistency of rules and reason above people as ends. We might, though, look to Kant's view of human autonomy for a more positive picture. Ronald Dworkin takes such an optimistically positive view of Kant when he writes ambiguously that Kant's moral philosophy only seems to be the paradigm of self-abnegation. He says that with freedom as dignity, it becomes a morality of self-affirmation. But the above facts and further comments below challenge that view. The idea of autonomy or freedom expresses the third aspect of Kant's categorical imperative. Kant's autonomy means that we must choose to give ourselves the moral law. Here, autonomy anticipates the modern and existentialist emphasis on individuality, freedom and choice. But again, associations with existentialism as well as with Christianity reveal their shared weaknesses. For example, Hubert Dreyfus criticizes both Kantian and Sartrean autonomy in seeking to impose itself on the world. But Kantian autonomy can also be seen as an appropriate antidote to religious passivity. That is, Kant was a Christian, but he held that morals must be based on free and informed choice, not God's authority. Again, unlike Greek and Judaic ethics, Christian and Kantian ethics also stress choice and intention. Intention or goodwill is of crucial significance in Kantian ethics, and we can again quote Kant saying that nothing can be conceived in the world which can be called good except the goodwill. Yet we need to note Kant's special as well as his noted cognitivist qualifications of this goodwill. These are that 1. It must be free and without constraint. 2. It must be informed by reason. And 3. It must be correctly motivated and not prudential. These seem to be entirely reasonable. But in Kant's view, motivations from personal gain, expediency or inclination are not moral, they are amoral. For example, helping people because you really enjoy helping people is, in Kant's view, amoral, not moral. So acting on an inclination to do good is oddly lacking in and is a criticism of Kantian ethics. But on Aristotle's virtue ethics, Kantian ethics of will or intention are regarded as only attempts to do good. Conversely, Aristotle's virtue ethics sees morality as acting out of good character or disposition. Only acts that spring naturally from character are regarded as genuine expressions of good. This accords with the modern understanding of authenticity and counts against Kantian ethics. But we can also understand how inclinations and feelings are sometimes inappropriate in ethical theory and practice. The question is how to know when to overlook feelings and when to act on them. My view is that feelings are crucial as symptoms of moral action, but are inadequate as criteria. And Kant had a similar view about happiness as a consequence, not a goal of moral action. But I don't have time to develop these views here based on value experience. Yet the issue of feelings immediately raises not only their possible conflict with Kantian reason, but also the place of subjectivity, moral intent, duty, dignity, integrity, and value in Kantian ethics. But for Kant, the authority of morality is based on reason that is both a capacity within us and a universal. And therein lies our capacities of responsibility, reasons for action, and motives that determine moral worth. And that responsibility, a reason for action, constitute the motive for action that Kant calls duty. And that we must perform our duty just because it is right, which has denoted a law of truth. Kant also argues that it is our duty just because it is right. It is a matter of reason alone. This may be an admirable attempt to reach an intuitively justifiable conclusion, but it hasn't gone unchallenged. Firstly, duties can conflict, and this can't be resolved by universality, which can also conflict. And as noted earlier, another critique of Kantian duty and his rigidities was made by Elizabeth Anscombe. She argued that ideas of duty, obligation, and law given by God have weakened or have been rejected, and she advocated replacing these principles with particular virtues as held by Aristotle. But this doesn't mean that theorists haven't tried to reconfigure Kantian ethics into a more acceptable form. Derek Parfit, for example, attempted to do this with his form of Kantian contractualism or social agreement. But for many of us, Kantian contractualism is a contradiction in terms, and Parfit's unificatory aspirations have also been widely questioned. Moving further afield, others like Foucault are looking for foundations for moral value in greater subjectivity. But Foucault is speaking about value as the care of the self in complex socio-political contexts. For myself, I look for formal principles in the structures of consciousness to provide universals that involve value. I argue that consciousness has properties that are structures like divisibility which produce value, and that value itself provides a principle of moral action, as I argue elsewhere. But Kant didn't have access to consciousness and value as foundational moral concepts. Yet Hilary Putnam finds a pathway to moral value through Kantian duty and dignity. He writes that the dignity of obeying the moral law, that is the motive which means ultimately the dignity of giving myself to a law, that all rational beings can also give themselves the dignity of autonomy, unquote. So Kant's dignity derives from choosing and affirming the moral law in the form of his categorical imperative. And Kant's view of duty as respect for the moral law connects it to dignity and thereby indirectly to value. But duties can conflict, and dignity isn't the only expression of value which competes with others. So Kant's moral law or categorical imperative can't depend on duty, dignity, or integrity. But we might accept it as a way of pursuing value as an affirmation of truth. That is, Kant holds that we must obey the moral law because it is right, or we would want to say true. And the truth is a more inescapable property for human will than the categorical imperative. So the will to truth is also a better, if not a conclusive, candidate of both universality and value. And I previously argued how a will to value can produce normative moral action. But that isn't the kind of universally uniform action that Kant is looking for. Yet as an explanation of morality, the will to truth also reflects values like dignity back onto the agent. In this way, Kantian ethics could be expressed in terms of a will to value or the pursuit of value. But this reinterpretation is contentious and wouldn't be accepted by neo-Kantians. This is because Kant holds that we must choose, affirm and act specifically on the moral law because it is right. But we must ask again, what is it about the moral law being right that compels us to act? There are problems about cognition, and is it compelling us to act just because it is right or true? But we don't have direct access to truth, as Kant himself also held. Then if truth isn't available to motivate us, we might be motivated by sincere belief. But sincere belief can be had about any number of things, but most compellingly about the will to truth. Yet there is much more to say about the relation between truth and value that can be said here. But this view does provide an alternative to Kant's problematic categorical imperative. Yet neo-Kantians like W.D. Ross have attempted to rescue Kantian ethics as an objective system of right or wrong. In response to the is-ought problem, Ross took value as supervenient upon certain non-evaluative features, such as a sensitivity to facts, which is similar to McDowell's noted favourable light. But it's questionable that such facts must yield motivation, as does the will to truth. And against the pluralism that I advocate, Ross attributed absolute priority of morals over all other concerns. Yet he also remodelled Kant's immutable duties into conditional obligations or prima facie duties. These were enforceable only under tight circumstances in the absence of overwhelming detriment. But this qualification is brought at the cost of multiple prima facie duties competing against each other. To resolve this, Ross said that we should obey the stronger duty of the greatest prima facie rightness. But in the real world, it isn't possible to determine which duties are prima facie or take precedence over others. So Ross returned to the idea that the selection and precedence of prima facie duties are self-evident and obvious. But practical difficulties show that they are not always self-evident or obvious. And in order for prima facie obligations to be credible, they must be both very few and be exceedingly compelling. That is, in my view, like the will to truth and the will to value. Christine Kosgaard is a more recent neo-Kantian who reconfigures Kant's account of objectivity. That is, she reconstrues practical reason to produce objective imperatives defined by the problems they resolve. And she does this as a constructivist, not by discovering moral principles based on external facts, but by constructing them through rational deliberation and the structure of human agency. That is, she considers how rational agency creates obligations and normativity. Kosgaard interprets Kant's categorical imperative as a principle that emerges from the structure of rational agency, rather than external command, but still in accordance with principles that could be universalized. This is because human agency is inherently normative in accordance with certain standards. But it's far from certain how her constructivism, that has to be worked out within practical situations, can either provide objective moral principles or explain how action can be immoral. In my view, that has to wait for rational agency to include the will to truth, as well as the fillip of value as a motivating and normative force. In conclusion, we can ask, can neo-Kantians redeem Kantian ethics, or can such tinkering never put it right? Kant's critiques of pure and practical reason were groundbreaking, but he had less than complete success. And we saw that his conceptions of reason, universality and objectivity were at the heart of the problem. Kant had a great appreciation of the complexities of theory, but little appreciation of the complexities of life. He lived his entire life in the city of Königsberg, never married, and people set their clocks by his walks. It is sometimes mentioned that he was Prussian, supposedly explaining his emphasis on duty. His interest in consciousness is prescient, but is epistemological and is a precondition of rationality and perception. He also laid great emphasis on freedom and intention, as well as the anthropocentricity of perception. In this way, Kant has sometimes been described as a progenitor of phenomenology. But like Descartes and Locke, he couldn't use either mind or value as a moral framework, because he didn't have access to developed concepts of consciousness or value. Yet we saw that Kant's embrace of universality and his ambivalence about feelings had certain merits, but he had to omit both consciousness and value despite his appreciation of mind in epistemology. With respect to value, his aesthetic consisted of a rational framework of space and time, and his renowned categories of human thought makes no mention of graduation. Kantian ethics also suffers from the problems of cognitive motivation, value establishment, human abnegation, outdated reason, and prioritization of reason over people, for which an adequate theory of value isn't given. So my main criticisms of Kant's ethics is thereby that it is rationalist and one-dimensional. It is one-dimensional because it views the complexities of life through a single rationalist prism. He ignores mitigating circumstances, competing values, and different levels of awareness. He affirms the classical unity of mind, but not as consciousness, and he thereby can't consider its divisibility as one of the origins of value. For example, Kant's one-dimensional view of people as ends in themselves is given as fact, not subject to elaboration. And for Kant, intrinsic value depends on people's rationality, not the affirmation or enhancement of value. So we can't consider ethics for infants, for animals, or for non-rational adult humans. So the genius of Kant has been overtaken by the philosophical developments of the modern world. But to understand either of them, an understanding of Kant is a preparatory requirement. So let me have your comments and criticisms at the meeting or on websites like Zoom or meetup.com.